One morning just after sunrise, Elon Musk's 5-year-old son walked into the kitchen, climbed into his father's lap, and whispered something that froze the world's most logical man in his tracks. "Daddy, I saw heaven." As we step forward on this incredible story, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss more stories like this. What followed wasn't just a dream, it was a message. The house, usually buzzing with the hum of advanced technology, felt unusually quiet for a Wednesday morning. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, catching dust particles like tiny stars in stillness. Machines were in standby mode, their low hums the only reminder that this wasn't like most homes. It was sleek, intelligent, almost self-operating. From the stove to the lights to the blinds, everything responded to Elon's voice or schedule. Even the espresso machine prepared itself before he stepped inside. But that morning, Elon didn't notice the coffee waiting for him. Lost in thought, he absent-mindedly tapped at a tablet filled with launch schematics, AI calibration notes, and emails. His schedule was packed as always: Zoom calls with SpaceX engineers, government briefings, and press consultations. He had already skimmed through it all before the sun had fully risen. He didn't look tired, though. He looked like a man who had made peace with constant acceleration, someone who had stopped fighting the current and simply merged with it. Then, at precisely 6:42 a.m., the soft sound of bare feet padding across the tile caught his attention. X, still in his pale blue pajamas with hair sticking out in all directions, stood there rubbing his eyes, his stuffed owl tucked under one arm. Elon greeted him gently. "Hey buddy, you're up early." X didn't answer. He slowly walked over to the table and climbed into a chair, his legs swinging far from the floor. He carefully set his stuffed owl down like it might break. Elon reached out to ruffle his hair, but X was silent, deep in concentration. Finally, X whispered something that stopped Elon cold. "Daddy, I saw heaven." Elon blinked. "Heaven?" he repeated, unsure how to respond. X finally looked up, his eyes wide but calm. There was no excitement, no playfulness, just certainty. "I saw it last night. I was flying but not with wings. There was music without sound and a river that didn't go down, it went up into the sky." Elon stared at him. He had never heard his son talk like this, not even close. X had always been imaginative, yes, drawing strange machines and building towers from magnets and wires, but this wasn't imagination. This was something else. Elon managed to smile. "Sounds like a pretty wild dream," but X shook his head. "It wasn't a dream. It was real. I wasn't sleeping in the dream, I was awake. There but not here." There was something unsettling in his tone, a seriousness that didn't match the voice of a 5-year-old. X continued, "There was a man holding the owl." He paused, clutching the stuffed animal tighter. He was very shiny but not like metal. He glowed, his face looked like fire and sky. He didn't talk with his mouth, but I heard him in my chest. Intrigued, Elon leaned forward. "What did he say?" X was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "He asked me, 'What do you want to bring back?'" The kitchen, still bathed in the warm morning light, suddenly felt heavy. Elon didn't answer. His hand hovered over the forgotten coffee cup. After a long pause, he asked, "What did you tell him?" X smiled softly. "I said I didn't know," he admitted. "And then he showed me a place full of colors that don't exist here and I felt really warm." Elon tried to process the strange, clear, and deeply coherent words his son had spoken. His rational mind quickly dismissed it as just a dream, perhaps influenced by cartoons or books, but still there was something in X's voice, a clarity, an ancient certainty, that made him pause. Later that morning, X stayed home with his nanny. He asked for crayons and paper, but instead of drawing robots or rockets, he began sketching clouds that looked like buildings and people made of light. One drawing showed a tree with no leaves, only golden roots stretching up into the sky. When the nanny asked what he was drawing, X answered softly, "Home, but not here." That night, when Elon returned home, he had almost forgotten about the morning conversation, until he saw the door to X's room cracked open. Inside, the boy was asleep, wrapped in blankets, his stuffed owl nestled beside him. On the floor were 3 drawings. Elon picked one up, and at first glance, it looked like a simple child's attempt at drawing a sunrise. But there was something about the symmetry, the lines, the intentionality. It looked more like architecture than imagination. At the top of the drawing, in uneven crayon letters, were the haunting words, "I didn't bring anything back yet." Elon stared at it. His fingers trembled as he folded the drawing and walked into his study. He sat at his desk, staring at it for hours, surrounded by project tabs, Mars simulations, AI protocols, emergency designs, all buzzing around him like white noise. Yet, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the lines his son had drawn, the strange golden roots, the gentle buildings in the clouds, and the tiny figure standing beneath a golden arch. And those words, "I didn't bring anything back yet." Elon wasn't a stranger to wonder. He had built his empire on it. But this felt different. Not like discovery but like memory. The next day he asked the nanny to cancel X's tutoring session. He stayed home longer than usual, hovering around the kitchen, unsure what to do with his hands. Finally, he sat down with X and gently asked, "Can I ask you more about your dream?" X nodded, blinking slowly. Elon asked, "Do you remember anything else about the place you saw? How you got there?" X was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "I closed my eyes but not the ones on my face." Elon frowned. "What do you mean?" X touched his chest. "These eyes," he said, pointing to his heart. Then he looked up at his father with a calmness that felt far beyond his years. "I think I was somewhere before I came here." Elon blinked. "Before you were born?" X nodded. "There was music but it didn't sound like anything. It felt like love was hugging me." The words sent a chill down Elon's spine. He didn't know why. Maybe because it didn't sound like storytelling, it felt like remembering. Later that night, Elon pulled out an old letter his mother had written to him when he turned 18. He hadn't read it in years, but when he unfolded it, the ink was still legible. "Elon," it read, "you've always been brilliant. You'll change the world, I'm sure. But don't forget the child who used to stare at the stars and wonder if someone was staring back. That child was closer to the truth than the man you'll become. One day, I hope you'll remember what you knew before you were smart." Elon slowly folded the letter, his hand trembling. X's words echoed in his mind, "I think I was somewhere before I came here." Days passed and X continued to draw, no longer robots or cars, but spirals within spirals, light without source, golden trees growing toward floating doors. He hummed tunes no one recognized and asked questions that Elon couldn't answer. Why do people forget the real place? Do trees miss heaven when they grow here? Will the man of light come back for me? Elon began recording their conversations not to analyze but simply to preserve them. There was something sacred in X's voice, something that made even the smartest man in the world feel unqualified to speak. One night, while tucking X into bed, Elon asked softly, "Do you think heaven is where people go after they die?" X shook his head. "It's where they go when they stop being scared." Elon felt something pierce his chest. "And what happens if someone doesn't stop being scared?" he asked. X looked up at him with deep, knowing eyes. "They get stuck here." That night, Elon stood outside on the balcony, staring up at the stars. He had spent billions trying to reach Mars, but now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been missing something. Something closer, quieter, more ancient, not out there but above and within. It had been almost 2 weeks since the first morning X told Elon he'd seen heaven, and yet Elon couldn't bring himself to speak about it to anyone. Not his team, not his mother, not even the reporters hounding him about the new lunar base. Not even Grimes, who had called twice from Tokyo and left 2 polite voicemails. He couldn't speak about it because the words his son had shared didn't fit into any category Elon had ever known. They weren't intellectual, they weren't creative, and they weren't even mystical. They were simply true, and that made them terrifying. Elon began clearing his calendar, spending more time at home, which only made his board uneasy and confused his engineers. It wasn't that he was avoiding work, it was that he was avoiding noise. There was too much of it, too much noise in the media, in his inbox, and most of all, in his own mind. Now, this strange, haunting voice of his child had opened a space where silence wasn't just something he craved, it was something he needed. He started asking X to draw again. Not out of curiosity like a typical parent, but with the reverence of a man visiting an oracle. Every morning, X would produce a new drawing, always childlike yet oddly consistent. Spirals within spirals, light without source, a tree with golden roots growing toward a floating door. Elon didn't understand the images, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him through them. One night Elon asked, "Can you draw the man you saw?" X nodded and quietly set to work. It took him 20 minutes. The result was rough but unmistakable. A figure taller than the others, body radiant, head surrounded by rings of color that looked like sound waves. No face, no feet. And in the space where the heart should be, a white flame was drawn with such force that the paper was nearly torn. Above the figure, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "He was made of now." Elon stared at the drawing, confused. "What does that mean, buddy?" X shrugged. "He wasn't yesterday or later. He was all at the same time." Elon sat beside him, overwhelmed. "Did he say anything again?" X nodded. He told me the stars are windows but we keep trying to live inside them. Later that night, Elon dug through astrophysics files, hoping to find some answer that could make sense of the symbols. But science had no explanation. So he opened a different file, a locked, hidden archive in his private journal. There were only 2 entries inside. One was a letter he had written at age 10. Dear God, are you real? If you are, please make it not hurt to be alive. I'll believe in you forever. The second entry, written at 23, simply read, I waited. You never showed. He stared at those words for what felt like an eternity, then closed the file, leaning back in his chair. The darkness of his study, lit only by the moonlight outside and the faint hum of the house systems, felt suffocating. He whispered almost bitterly, what if you're showing up now, and you're using my son? There was no answer, but the silence felt different this time. Less empty. More full. The next morning when Elon came downstairs, X wasn't at the table. Instead, he was outside in the garden, sitting cross-legged with his owl beside him. Elon watched from the window for a moment before walking outside. You okay? Elon asked, his voice soft. X nodded, then without turning to face him, said, the man told me something in a dream last night. Elon crouched beside him. What did he say? X looked up, his eyes bright but solemn. He said your father is afraid of forgetting. Elon stood frozen. He had never spoken about his fear of memory to anyone. Not in therapy, not to his mother, not even to Grimes or in writing. But it was real. He had spent his life running from certain memories, the pain of childhood, the shame, the loneliness, the questions. He buried it all beneath rockets, wires, and the relentless pursuit of ambition. Now, his 5-year-old son had unearthed it with a single sentence. Elon looked away, his voice barely able to work when he asked, do you think that man is still watching us? X answered without hesitation, yes, but not like looking, more like feeling us. That night, Elon did something he hadn't done since college. He prayed. Not aloud, not in any formal way, but he closed his eyes and whispered into the dark. If you're there, please don't let him forget. Don't let me forget either. The next day X drew something new. It wasn't like the others. It was earth, cracked like glass, floating above it. 2 hands, one of fire and one of shadow, held it between them, not fighting but balancing. Above them, a figure drawn in gold crayon. This time it had a face. It was Elon's face, but with eyes that weren't his. Elon Musk wasn't the kind of man to believe in signs. His world was built on numbers, probabilities, logic, and systems. But ever since his 5-year-old son told him he'd seen heaven, Elon had begun to unravel in silent, slow ways. It wasn't public. No one outside the walls of his home could have known that anything had changed. His team still received directives. His projects moved forward. He still reviewed Mars shuttle specs and satellite data over coffee. He still made billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. But something had shifted inside him. Like an old satellite pulled from its orbit, drawn closer to something it had once passed by without noticing. And now he couldn't stop circling the question. What if my son really saw something? Not imagined, not dreamed, but saw? The latest drawing sat in front of him. One of X's most unusual. It depicted Earth, cracked like porcelain, floating between 2 hands, one black, one bright orange. Above the image, hovering like a witness, was a golden face. Elon's face. But the eyes were hollow, empty sockets filled with stars. When Elon asked what it meant, X only said, you were watching us. But not like a person. You were learning how to love. Elon had no answer. You still didn't? That night, something pulled him out of bed at 2:13 a.m. The house was silent. He walked barefoot through the darkened hallways, passing motion-activated lights that stayed off almost respectfully, as if the home sensed he wasn't looking for visibility. He made his way to X's room and slowly opened the door. The boy was asleep, curled on his side, one hand gripping the tail of his owl. His drawings covered the far wall, some taped carelessly, others pinned with magnets. It looked less like a child's gallery and more like a chapel wall in miniature. Elon stared at the images. Spirals, windows in the sky, golden cities, rivers that defied gravity, beings of light, beings of shadow, a bridge with no beginning or end, and now himself watching. The next day, Elon called someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Eleanor Shaw, a retired neuroscientist who had worked with him during his early neuro-related ventures. But long before that, she had spent a decade as a pediatric psychologist specializing in children with spiritual near-death experiences. Back then, Elon had rolled his eyes at that kind of research. Now he asked her to fly in. Eleanor arrived, wearing a long gray coat and carrying a leather-bound notebook. Her eyes were sharp, serene. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "He's 5?" she asked after reviewing the first few drawings. "Yes," Elon replied. "And he's never heard anyone in your home speak of heaven?" "No religious books, nothing," Elon answered. She flipped through the images again, then looked up at him. "You need to understand something. I've studied this for 20 years. I've interviewed dozens of children across continents, some who nearly drowned, some who coded on the operating table, some who simply dreamed. They all describe different visuals, but the emotional patterns are identical. Silence that feels alive. Light that isn't hot. Language without words. A presence that asks, not commands, but asks the same thing. What will you carry back?" Elon exhaled. "He said something like that." Eleanor nodded. "They all do." He paused. "Do you believe in it?" Eleanor smiled faintly. "I believe they believe. And I believe it changes them." She asked to speak to X alone. Elon hesitated but agreed. They sat in the garden for nearly an hour. Eleanor didn't take notes. She just listened. X didn't seem shy. He spoke softly as if describing something fragile. When they returned, Eleanor was quiet. Her eyes seemed brighter somehow, but her voice was lower. "What did he say?" Elon asked. She looked him in the eyes. "He said the man of light told him to tell you something." Elon's pulse quickened. "What?" She looked him directly in the eyes and said, "Tell him he's still my son even if he never believes." Elon sat down, saying nothing. Eleanor didn't offer an interpretation. She simply gathered her things, gave X a gentle pat on the head, and told Elon she would stay nearby if needed. Then she left. That night Elon didn't work. He sat in the dark in his study, hands folded over the top of X's newest drawing. This one was different. It showed a hallway made of glass, stretching into a glowing sky. On one side, children with stars in their eyes walked. On the other side, adults, faceless and dark, walked, all looking back. Only one figure walked forward. It was X alone. Elon fell asleep in his chair, and sometime before dawn he dreamed. But not a normal dream. He was walking through a city that glowed gold from within. The sky was pulsing, not with clouds but with waves of music. He couldn't hear it, only feel it. The buildings were made of memory. He knew that instinctively. Everyone in the city was made of stories. You could read their lives just by looking at them. He passed one person who radiated warmth. It was his mother, but not as she was now. As she had been when he was 6. She smiled at him, said nothing, then turned and walked into a doorway of light. Elon tried to follow, but something stopped him. He turned, and behind him stood a tall figure made of shimmering light. No face, just present. The figure reached out, not with hands but with intent. And Elon heard it speak, not in sound but in essence. "You've carried the future long enough. Now carry the eternal." He woke up shaking. The next morning, he found X at the breakfast table, staring at the drawing of the hallway. "I had a dream last night," Elon said quietly. X looked up. "I think I saw what you saw." Elon's throat tightened. "You did?" X gave a small, knowing smile. "I asked him to let you." Elon didn't respond right away, then softly said, "Thank you for showing me." X's eyes fluttered, sleep already pulling him under, but just before he drifted off he mumbled, "I didn't show you. I just asked him to." In the days that followed, Elon changed things. Not publicly, not in speeches or interviews, but in private, irreversible ways. He quietly funded chapels and refugee camps, built solar-powered shelters near children's hospitals, and established a foundation, unnamed, unbranded, that offered end-of-life support to terminal families. The application had only one requirement. Someone must have been forgotten. He stopped calling it giving. He started calling it returning. One morning, X woke up early again. This time he wasn't sleepy or silent. He walked into the kitchen, took a crayon, and drew a single shape on the back of an envelope. It was a door floating in the sky. He handed it to his father. "What's this?" Elon asked. X just smiled. "It's for you." Elon turned the envelope over. There was nothing inside, just one word written across the flap in small, careful letters. "Remember." Elon never forgot. Not the dream, not the question, not the place beyond the sky with buildings of light, rivers that flowed upward, and a voice that once asked a child, "What will you bring back?" Elon had brought back wonder. He had brought back mercy. And finally he had brought back love. Subscribe to Hidden Raylit to hear more of these epic stories.